I've played a lot of Famicom games, and one of the cool things about that is that when you look past what the NES had to offer solely in America, you unlock a wonderful vault to understanding how video gaming thrived after the video game crash. That being said, there are good Famicom games, and there are bad Famicom games. Today we're going to focus on the bad ones, games that made me want to sign up for the Ocean Gate Titanic tour. They aren't great. These aren't the worst on the console, but they certainly aren't worth your time. Let's begin. Tin Yard Fight is a primitive football game from Irem, and if you've played the arcade version of this, it isn't so bad. But if you pop in the Famicom version, you'll realize quickly that the handheld Mattel football game was eons better than this. And that game had hyphens for people. Hyphens! Also, it's kind of different than the NES version. In the NES version, we choose what level we want to play in terms of difficulty, but on the Famicom version, it's much more like the arcade game. You start at the easiest difficulty, and you solely focus on getting the touchdowns and working your way up to professional, to the Super Bowl. So I hope you like moving at a snail's pace, listening to 8-bit stomping sounds. ER Kung Fu is considered by many to be one of the first proper fighting games, and I viewed it as that, a company dipping their toes into the idea of making a one-on-one proper fighting game. In the arcade, this was cheap as cheap could get. You'd get annihilated by the CPU, and that was the nature of the beast. It was an arcade game. If they let you win, you wouldn't put more money into it. Then they ported it to multiple platforms, but the one I played was the Famicom, and for a fighting game, it has some bad hitboxes, like jank hitboxes. It almost boils down to being able to hit the button quicker than your opponent. To me, it's a very lazy port of a very well-known Konami game from their earlier years. During my Konami Conquest, I played a lot of Famicom games, and I was exposed to plenty different franchises. Why do I say that? Because this is a crossover game. And all of those franchises are represented here. Konami Man and Konami Lady, who were mascots for Konami back then, Goemon from Ganbare Goemon, Simon Belmont from Castlevania, Getsufuma from his titular title, Getsufuma Den, Mikey from the Goonies, King Kong, Twinbee, Vic Viper, Upa, Penta, they're all here. And the whole idea is that we go through 6 levels and at some point we win. I don't know enough about this game to say how it ends or what it's about because I couldn't translate it. But what I can say is that the only reason why I decided to stop playing it was the sheer amount of cheap enemies and the gross inability to avoid damage. It almost felt like everything that I was taking was mandatory. Tetsuwan Atom, also known as Astro Boy, is a manga created by the godfather of manga, Osamu Tezuka. If you watch my Series Slayer episode about Hinotori, he created that, and he created roughly 700 manga series before succumbing to cancer and dying in 1989. So this is Konami's ever so loyal tribute to Tezuka, and it absolutely blows. All you can do as Astro Boy is jump and occasionally punch things, and you have to master this dreadful jump mechanic that 100% will fuck you over. And to be honest, 1989 Konami, not a good year. And this was the icing on the cake. I beat this, but I used save states. There's no way I would ever want to play this again. You know how I love track and field? This is track and field, but a slightly different one. If you want to be exact, it's the sequel to track and field in the arcade, not the NES version. Those are 2 different games. Instead, this is a port of Hyper Sports, the arcade game, known in Japan as Hyper Olympic 84. You have all the standard events like you would in track and field, swimming, skeet shooting, long horse, etc. But the problem is, there are these stupid gimmicks tied to literally everything and the controls are dreadful. Instead of pushing buttons, we have to wag the D-pad left and right. It absolutely sucks on the fingers. It was not for me, and in some ways, even the arcade version wasn't for me. If you're an RPG loyalist, this is probably going to kick your ass, my horrible take. When you see Final Fantasy III, don't freak out. It's not Final Fantasy III on the Super Nintendo, that game rocks. This is Final Fantasy III, aka the first game in the series to feature a job system, on the Famicom. Usually I don't care for games that feature job systems based on principle, but Final Fantasy III makes it mandatory for you to use new jobs to unlock more plot points, so all that grinding you're doing to get better? Not enough. Do more. There's one part in the game that absolutely boiled my blood into plasma and vinegar, and it was a fight with a goon called Garuda. He's a birdman, and up until that point, you've never had access to the Dragoon class. Then magically you do, and you're stuck in that one area until you grind the shit out of Dragoon just to level up enough to fight Garuda and never use it again. Final Fantasy 3 and 5, in my opinion, they just aren't fun. I don't like grinding for jobs on top of grinding just to survive, and it really detracts from my gameplay experience. That being said, if you want a much more streamlined experience, this was on the Nintendo DS, and while I didn't tend to enjoy many DS games, I much rathered it over the Famicom entry. Doraemon is an anime, a very important one actually. Doraemon is considered a national treasure of Japan, and that opened up the floodgates for people to create whatever bullshit they wanted to with this stupid, smiling, robotic cat face all over it. So who better to take the responsibility of making a video game than Hudson Soft? In Doraemon, we start the game by pushing start and immediately causing epileptic seizures. I swear to God, in the 80s, if you had epilepsy, good luck, because the video game industry didn't give a fuck about you. The game itself, it's 3 stages of incoherent nonsense. The first level is a top-down adventure with hidden holes. Second is a shooter, and the final stage is an aquatic scavenger hunt. At no point during this game was I even slightly happy, and I dreaded dying because if I did, back to the epileptic scene, rinse, wash, and repeat. Now, as I mentioned, this is a Japanese treasure, and there's been a shit ton of games released for it. The most recent that I know of is Doraemon Story of Seasons. Who knows? Maybe I'll check it out sometime. You've heard of Fire Emblem, right? This is the first game, Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light, way back in 1990. And yeah, it looks really primitive in comparison to the later entries, but we all have to start somewhere. In this game, we play as Marth, and we lead legions of different units to fight against the Dole Empire. Now, I enjoyed this game for the first few missions before I realized that we have to buy our equipment while we fight. And that's so stupid. Just let me control units and destroy stuff. By the 11th level, I was screwed because I didn't buy something in the 4th level, because there's limits on how many times you can use an attack. It's horrible, and while I don't mind permadeath, it can really screw you over. I wanted to like this, I really did, because I enjoy tactical RPGs so much, but this one was too much for me. Now, it was remade for the Nintendo DS as Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon, and to be honest, I might check it out in lieu of this. As a flagship franchise, Fire Emblem is still prominently represented by Nintendo, and the most recent game was Fire Emblem Engage on the Nintendo Switch. This game is part of a series known as Compati Hero. It's an epic crossover of Gundam, Kamen Rider, and Ultraman, so I was immediately interested in checking it out. The first game I played was SD Hero Sokessen Taose Akunu Gundam on the Famicom, and I enjoyed it. It's like a side-scrolling platformer shooter. But I wanted to go further back and play the first game, SD Battle Ozumo Heisei Hirobasho. It's a sumo wrestling game, and we choose the characters we want, and basically have a career in sumo wrestling. The problem is, the game is nauseating. Once the fight is over, they flash these lights and they flashbang you. Add in that some levels have weird backgrounds, so it's like an LSD stamp stapled to your forehead. The game itself isn't fun either. You just slap the shit out of your opponent by being better at smashing buttons, and if you're lucky, you can throw them. It's not worth it. That being said, this franchise has a rich history in Japan, and there are tons of games for you to check out. You could also check out its brother franchise, Super Robot Wars, which is awesome. If you look into the history of Dragon Ball games, there are quite a few. In fact, it started on the Epoch Cassette Vision. It was a very rudimentary game. I haven't played it yet, but this was before my self-imposed rules of release. So instead, I played Shinran Nono, which translates to Shinran's Mystery. But the real mystery is trying to figure out, why the fuck is Goku always dying? He's the Mr. Meeseek of the 8-bit era. The only other person who could give him a run for his money is that douchebag from Adventure Island. But in Adventure Island, it makes sense. I'm getting ahead of myself. In Shinran Nono, we go through a rough adaptation of the first 2 volumes of Dragon Ball, which I thought was cool. There's some overhead segments, some 2D segments, but the one key issue is that Goku is always hungry. And in a game where you need to run around constantly looking for certain enemies or items, an active hunger gauge acting as time pressure is obnoxious. Now some of you might think, wow, this looks familiar. Well, it was on the NES, but it was released as Dragon Power. And instead of it being based on Dragon Ball, it was based on Journey to the West. All of our characters are replaced, with Goku being a generic fighting guy, Bulma being Nora, Yamcha being Lancer, etc. I haven't played it, but if it's anything like this, no, fuck it. And that's it for today. What do you think about this list? Are there any games you don't like on the Famicom? Make sure to comment down below. Maybe someone will do you a solid and save you some frustration. Also, if you don't mind, we're very close to 4,000 subscribers, which is an awesome milestone. If you have any friends or family that love remembering when life was a little bit easier to live, feel free to bring them to the community. Finally, the most important thing you can do is hit that thumbs up button, as it directly affects the visibility of the channel and all the projects that I work on every day. As always, from my family to your family, good energy, good vibes, Fortefyre out.